Hello, Bakujin here, and in this video I'm doing a tier list of visual novels I've read. First off is Fashioning Little Miss Lonesome. This is an Otome visual novel, which in my opinion has great comedy. Unfortunately, I don't really like the characters, the romance, or the story that well, so while the comedy is great, I don't really want to put it above C tier. Fault Milestone is a fairly interesting story, has pretty decent characters, nice world building, but it's nothing special at all, at least in my opinion, with the current parts released, so I think it belongs in C tier. Funbag Fantasy is in my opinion a great example of merging H scenes and a well told story. The way it manages to integrate these elements is really great, and overall, it's a really good visual novel that I think belongs in A tier. Go Go Nippon is in my opinion a pretty decent guide for Japan, but I don't really think it works that great as a visual novel, so D tier. I didn't want to have too many things on the tier list, so a lot of these are just the first titles representing a series. So this is the Grisaya trilogy, not just Fruit of Grisaya. As for what I think of the Grisaya trilogy, well, I absolutely love it. Fruit of Grisaya is my favorite visual novel, and the two others are really great as well. So, easy S tier. Harmony is a sweet but quite bland and rather boring visual novel, D tier. Harmonia overall is a pretty decent emotional story, but I don't really think it stands out that much, so C tier. Heartful Boyfriends, yeah, pigeons are mid, D tier. I know some people really like Highway Blossom, but I didn't really find it that interesting, D tier. Idol Magical Girl Michiru is a spin-off of the Grisaya trilogy. It is a fairly decent visual novel, but considering the characters in it, it should have been way better, so a disappointing C tier. A Kiss for the Petal, Maidens of Michael is a cute Yuri visual novel with a bunch of cute couples. Though while the characters are cute, I do find their interactions to be somewhat boring, so C tier. I like the general over-the-top comedy of Emote Paradise, and think the characters are pretty good for an ikiga, though the series is very repetitive with 2 and 3 being very similar to the original, so C tier. Japanese school life is, in my opinion, underwhelming, D tier. It's been a while since I've read Karakara, but I remember the story and the characters being decent, so C tier. Kyoto Colorful Days has some interesting story concepts, but it's just way too short to properly handle them and end up feeling extremely rushed. D tier. Lamination started off really funny, and I thought it would be really good, though in my opinion the comedy got a bit stale quite fast and it just kind of overstayed its welcome. So yeah, I think bottom of the C tier is where that belongs. Love Cube is a decent harmonic game with good art, so yeah, C tier. The Love Connie spin-offs released by Mo Novel are really boring, uninteresting, and I hate how they released it censored in English first, pretending like this was the full version, and then later released the 18 plus version in Japan. Would be bottom D tier if it didn't really piss me off, but I'm salty enough to put it down to E tier. Lucy the Eternity She Wished For has some emotional moments, but overall, I found it shallow, uninteresting, and I've seen many stories with similar concepts done way better. Manka Hunter is a fun ikigai, it has great art, pretty good comedy, and the over-the-top setting works quite well. The characters do lack depth, but I think for what it is pretty good, so low B tier. Maggot Bait is a really dark, messed up story. While there were moments that made me cringe either due to how messed up the hate scenes were, or the over the top stupid religious stuff, I generally found it to be pretty interesting. And it certainly is very different from a lot of other visual novels I've read. Personally, I liked it a fair amount, and I actually want to give it a B. A Little Lily Princess is pretty good. The start is a bit slow, but overall the story is pretty nice and the characters are decent, so a C. Magical Marriage Lunatics has a somewhat weak start, but the character routes are a fair bit better. Some of the character routes are actually quite good. Though taking the entire visual novel as a whole, I don't think it deserves to be above a C. Malice Code I found to be rather boring. It's a horror visual novel, it has some decent concepts, but overall I didn't really like it, so D tier. Mamai Rogue Faucet is decent enough, low end C tier. Pleasure Pets has good arts, and that's about where my positive critique ends. The characters are really one note, and the writing is generally just really bad. E tier. Nenokami has a pretty nice story, decent characters, and some nice Yuri scenes. I think it's a C tier. Negliga has some good art, but I didn't really like the characters and the story that much. D tier. Nekonin EX Heart is another fairly generic visual novel. Kind of shallow characters, comedy's okay enough. The story isn't that great though, so low end C tier. I know some people will hate me for saying this, but I actually really like Nekopara. The characters aren't deep, but I find them to be fun, and I like the absurd comedy and the absurd world building of Nekopara. This is, in my opinion, a good mix of relaxed vibes and beautiful artwork and a nice soundtrack. And overall, I just really enjoyed my time with the Nekopara visual novels. So yeah, this actually goes in A tier. New Game The Challenge Stage is a fairly well made new game visual novel. It is far from as good as the anime, but does a decent job at retaining its charm and presents the characters well. So C tier. Newton and the Apple Tree belongs in B tier in my opinion. It's a pretty nice story, has good characters, and the pacing is rather fast, which I found to be quite nice as too many visual novels are really slow paced. The fast pacing did make some things feel rushed though, but overall I still think it worked really well. Aokana is a very interesting sports romance visual novel. I really like the characters, the art, and I think overall the concept is really nice. If there is one thing to criticize, I think the romance feels a bit underwhelming, but despite this, I think it belongs in A tier. Nurse Love Addiction I found to be okay enough, so low C tier. Onyx is also, in my opinion, a low C tier. Other than it being about incest, it is pretty much just a standard plain romance visual novel without anything really that interesting to offer. Planetarian is a short emotional story. While I did find the later part to be quite good, I did find the earlier parts to be a bit boring, and I think it deserves to be in high C tier. Princess Evangel I really liked. It is kind of a standard romance visual novel, but I really liked the characters and I thought it executed what it tried to do quite well. I'm going to put this in A tier, though one thing to note is that this is one of the earlier visual novels I've read, so given the amount of similar types of visual novels I've read, my opinion could potentially have been different if I read it recently. I love the ReZero anime. This visual novel though, called ReZero Kiss or Death, is just really horrible. The writing's terrible, there are boring scenes that are just way too long, it's just utter trash, F tier. Sabbath of the Witch feels very much like your typical harem romance visual novel. Where it stands out though is in its quality. Both in terms of production value and in terms of the writing, I think it does a good job at standing above similar visual novels. And I think it deserves a low A tier. While this says Sakura Dungeon, this is more so supposed to represent the Sakura series in general, at least the ones I've read. And there are a bunch of low effort visual novels that I think belong in E tier. Sankaku Renai was kind of underwhelming for me. The characters weren't that great in my opinion, and the comedy just didn't hit for me most of the time. Not a bad visual novel, but I had higher hopes. I think low C tier is fair though, since I don't feel it quite is down there in the D tier in terms of quality. Sayano Uta is a really well made horror visual novel. It is quite short, but it has an interesting concept that it executes really well, and some moments I found to be really powerful, especially one of the endings. It is quite messed up, but if you're okay with the grotesque messed up things, I would recommend it. A tier. Sound of Drop is another horror visual novel, but this one I didn't really like, so D tier. Planet is a very emotionally strong visual novel. Both the visual novel and the anime adaptation of the story are really highly regarded, and in my opinion, for a good reason. It made me cry, so S tier. Starless is a well made, high quality Nukiga. It is not for everyone, and it's not really for me. While I did find the early parts intriguing, it went a bit too much into degeneracy and suffering for me. And while reading through the endings, I completely stopped caring. I will give this a D tier, but I think it is good for a certain demographic. Sunrider Academy didn't really like the characters or the story or the gameplay system, so E tier. To Love Ru True Princess is a fairly poorly done spin off visual novel of To Love Ru. It repeats too many scenarios and jigs from the anime and manga, and due to it being on the PlayStation Vita, the sexual jigs are just way too tame compared to the original. There are some decent parts to it though, so I will give it a D. Tokyo School Life is another D. It's an unremarkable visual novel that I barely remember. Tropical Liquor is a Honey Pop clone, and too bad that they only copied the puzzle minigames from Honey Pop, as the characters and the comedy is far worse. Think Honey Pop, but with bland characters. A tier. Wild Romance is another visual novel with bland characters. The characters have almost no personality, the comedy sucks, and the writing is repetitive and shallow. I think this is another E tier. Gochima wa Usagi desu ka? Wonderful Party is, in my opinion, a good example of how to do a spin off visual novel well. It retains the charm of the anime while telling an original story. And to me, it feels like it's about the same quality as the anime, which I think is a C tier. Tsugihage Makepeace was a pretty good visual novel in my opinion. It has good characters, a really strong start, and the romance is mostly well done. Some parts after the characters got together were a bit rushed in my opinion, especially with one of the girls, but I think it's good enough in general for a B tier, especially due to the really strong start. Rio Reincarnation is another B tier. Among the visual novels based on anime, this stands out as having the most effort put into it. I like the story, especially in Rina Utopia, and the art is from Tsunako, who is the original artist of the light novel. So I really like the art as well. The romance might not get as far as you generally get with 18 plus visual novels, but it went further than what you typically get in spin-off visual novels. Monobeno Happy End is a visual novel that I was really unsure about. It is fairly highly rated, though I was unsure if this was just due to a bunch of lolicons giving it a high score due to the art. When I read it though, I found it to be surprisingly good. It has a fantastic set of characters, a unique setting, interesting story, long, well written after stories, and probably the best production value of any visual novels I've read so far. Art knocking it out of the park in terms of both quality and quantity, a good soundtrack, and lastly, one of the most unheard of things in visual novels, a male main character who has voice acting. This belongs in S tier in my opinion. Doki Doki Literary Club has some pretty interesting things going on and it uses the medium really well. I did find the start to be rather weak, though it does get way better in the later half. I think this belongs in B tier. Genero Haruka has the best romance of any visual novel I've read. While there are others that I think do better comedy or story, it just stands at the top with regards to romance. It's just a fantastic visual novel that covers more than 10 years of the relationship between the main character and the different heroines, and I think it's a title that deserves to be an S tier. I really liked the Sakano anime. This anime was actually what got me into visual novels. Unfortunately, the visual novel for Sakano is absolutely horrible. It's boring and lacks any of the charm of the anime, and it's just an insult to read. F tier. Edoge Sex and Games Make Sexy Games is a pretty good Nukiga with fairly well written characters and pretty nice H scenes. I think it deserves a high C tier. Isex by the same creators is a terrible Nukiga with really bad writing, boring one note characters, and inconsistent art. Not quite bad enough for an F tier, but pretty close. Love Love Hime is a fairly well done generic visual novel that I think belongs in C tier. Oppai mo Haramase New Class has good art. That is the only positive quality it has. Otherwise, it sucks. E tier. The Oreimo visual novel is a fairly decent low C tier. Hanasaki Work Spring is a really well done romance visual novel. It has really great characters, adorable interactions, and is overall just really cute and relaxing. Some of the story aspects I didn't like that much, and I do think there were some unnecessary drama towards the end of the route that I think didn't work that well, but I still think it deserves a high B. The Umaru visual novel is pretty well done, feels kind of like the second season of Umaru, C tier. Amambo. I wanted to see how a lolicon visual novel was, and not only was it creepy, but it was also really boring. I do think that there is enough of a quality to it to not really put it below D tier though, so yeah, I will put it in D tier. This Nukiga, which name I don't remember, is a good example of something that only has visuals and an interesting concept as selling points. Calling the characters one-dimensional is an insult to other one-dimensional characters. E tier because, for me, put something in F tier, it really has to screw up big times. Kamiyabai was overall a somewhat underwhelming typical harem romance visual novel, low C tier. Ninki Seiyu is also a fairly typical romance harem visual novel, though it focuses on voice actors, and this does make it stand out a bit more, and the characters are also fairly nice, so I think a high C tier this time. The Hayore Nyaruko spin-off visual novel has one good joke. That is the only good thing I have to say about it. The rest of it is absolutely horrible. The writing of the visual novel is terrible, and the choice system is just really, really horrible. It's just a terrible visual novel. F tier, it's screwed up big time. The Ditzy Demons Are in Love with Me is, in my opinion, a good Nikige. It has fantastic art, great H scenes, good comedy, and despite the characters being rather simple, I like them quite a lot, so B tier. The Konosuba visual novel spin offs are an okay read, but considering how much I like the anime, it should have been way better. A low C tier visual novel of A or S tier show. It has been a while since I read the Sakurai visual novel, but I remember it being fairly nice, though severely inferior to the anime, so C tier. Supercon is a decent enough Nukige, but nothing about it really stands out, so C tier. Data Live Run Dystopia is a good example of having too many characters, trying too many things, and having too little time. The routes felt rushed, and I thought it failed with regards to its romance, its storytelling, and the slice of life scenes. D tier. Nisekoi Yomeri was the first visual novel I read, and I have a lot of fond memories of it. I remember a fair amount of things I really liked about it, though given that it was my first visual novel and the first non-textbook thing I read in Japanese, I think it's hard to give it a fair rating. I will put it in B tier though, but I am unsure how I would view it if I read it now. Plastic Memories is another garbage anime spin-off visual novel. Most of it is just a poorly done adaptation of content already in the anime, where the anime is vastly superior, and the only things of value that it adds are just way too short, so F tier. Henshin Pansuninate Pero is a good Nukiga with an interesting concept that it pulls off pretty well. The start is a bit slow, and I think there is a bit too much internal dialogue, though I still think it deserves B tier. Amakatsu has good H scenes, however the characters were bland and boring, and I didn't think the comedy worked that well, so D tier. Yamete One-chan is a good example of a short nukige done quite well. It isn't outstanding or anything, but it does what it sets out to do fairly well, so high C tier. Manketsu Happening has a good hentai adaptation. This is one of the rare cases where the hentai is better than the original, and by better I mean miles better. The visual novel is really bad with way too much internal monologue about boring things, and the H scenes are moving at glacial speed. E tier. Koisuru Dolls is a decent visual novel, not much to say about it, C tier. Love Commune is another fairly decent visual novel that I think belongs in C tier. Love Love Princess is another fairly well done visual novel, with one exception, and that is that one of the heroines is absolutely fantastic, and by herself I think she elevates it from a C to a B. Happy Maher has an interesting concept and really well done interesting art. I had high hopes for it, but the pacing was really slow and the characters weren't that good, so I don't think the characters were able to carry this slow pacing, and it ended up being a bit underwhelming. There were some good parts about it I liked, but overall I think it's fair to put it in low C tier. Maoten is a visual novel I think works as a good example of how not to mix story and comedy. It uses way too much time and effort on a convoluted plot with lots of stuff to remember, while also not taking itself serious. The comedy wasn't good enough to carry the visual novel, and these story segments just felt way too long and uninteresting, and because they weren't taken seriously later on, it just felt like a waste of time. I don't really think it had potential to be that good, but I think it could have been decent enough if it didn't have this problem. This is a D tier visual novel, in my opinion. Well, there it is, the full tier list showing how much I like the visual novels I've read so far. As you can see, there are a fair amount of visual novels I don't think are that great. In the future, I plan on focusing a lot more on reading highly regarded titles and avoiding poorly rated things, so hopefully in the future I'll have way more things in B tier and above. If there are any visual novels I've read that you wonder more about, you can ask me in the comments, or if you agree with my opinion or disagree with my opinion, you can tell me how great I am for sharing your opinion, or how much of a horrible piece of shit I am for disagreeing with you.